us. She's recording us. Run away, run away, run away.
It's actually a conspiracy.
Well, oddly enough, that you should say the word conspiracy because that's pretty much what we're discussing.
See,
So,
it worked out. I told you.
right. Considering that we're brand new at this and that this is a brand new concept for us, Toastie Ghosty, although brand new only in the sense that we thought of it
2 years ago.
24 months ago or so, 26 months ago. And we're now finally
This,
actually starting this.
this isn't a toddler. We don't have to refer to it in months. It absolutely can be years.
All right, 2 years ago, 2 years, 2 months, whatever you want to say. Um, I thought that the first thing we should do is just talk a little bit about the paranormal and what we what got us interested in this. And I'm going to say that for me, what got me most interested in this was in the beginning, as you know, and now anybody who watches this knows, I was born in 1970, and during 1970, of course, they in the 70s they had all these television programs, whether it was In Search of with Leonard Nimoy or Project Blue Book, which is actually it was an Air Force thing that went on, I think, from roughly 1956 to maybe 1968 or 69, where they were going around the country and actually investigating UFO sightings and crashes and all this other stuff. Things like the Spotsylvania monster, and or the one that was up in Maryland, or in the Dover Demon in Delaware. They would go and they would actually investigate this. Well, eventually they turned it into a dramatized television program, like they would do for anything. And in fact, I don't know this for a fact, but I suspect strongly that the X-Files, the television program that was very, very popular in the 90s, is somewhat based on Project Blue Book. So
Literally.
I think so. I mean, plus they had like the most ridiculous television programs, not just In Search of Leonard Nimoy, which was one of my favorites, but they had like there was an action television show called Bigfoot and Wild Boy, which I think you have unfortunately sat through at least once in your life. Um,
I think it was
and
2013. You went through this whole nostalgia phase.
could be.
Yeah.
um
hmm
or they would have, Sasquatch meets the $6 million man, and then of course, because it couldn't be outdone, they had to do it with the Bionic Woman. And so basically what I'm saying is my childhood was saturated with the idea of the paranormal and cryptozoology and UFOs, and it just really struck me. It was one of these things that was like, why can't this be real? Everybody is, walking around. I mean, I can remember a newspaper article coming out in the local paper, the Westerly Sun. And as my dad used to say, if you wanted to know what happened 4 days ago, pick up the Westerly Sun. All right. And I can remember him, telling me, oh, they had a sighting of Champ, which is, this supposed lake monster, sea monster, plesiosaur sort of thing that is in Lake Champlain in Vermont. And there were a lot of sightings of it throughout the 50s and 60s. Now, also the 60s, drugs. So, we don't know how much was real, but there was so
Mushroom
much.
induced.
There was there was so much around, and it was such a part of popular culture that there was no way to escape it, and that just lit my fire. I mean, I can remember watching the very first time I saw the In Search of show where they dealt with Bigfoot. I was convinced, because In Search of was on Saturday nights, and Sunday mornings I'd wake up really early for church because I was always nervous going to church, especially if I was like an altar boy, because you don't want to screw it up. And I remember like there being these two red dots, probably like, I don't know, the fire detectors or something, that were glowing out in the hall. And I was convinced it was Bigfoot sitting in my friggin' hallway in my house. It's just a demon though, nothing big. It's
It's
so
actually the
you just
ghost of the pilgrim.
you just had the stuff around you at all times. So yeah, that's what it is. And it never went away. Most people were
No,
of it,
I can
but
confirm. It has never.
but it has never gone away.
Yes, accurate.
So
True.
I would guess that yours started with your father being obsessed with Bigfoot. I don't know.
I mean, Yes, actually, I think the true origins was when I read that book, The Lock, when I was like 8, and I should not have had any business picking up that damn book because it was terrifying.
Are you talking
Um,
about the Steve Alton book?
yes, terrifying.
When it comes down that the Loch Ness monster is actually a bunch of Anguilla eels or Anguilla, or however you pronounce them.
They just kept eating people.
Well,
Like,
yeah, they were hungry.
okay,
There's not
well,
much to eat in the loch.
8-year-old Megan, terrified, horrified, actually, that the Loch Ness monster was in fact eating people. But that and Graham's house, because Graham's house was haunted to hell, frankly. And I mean, even as a like little child, we all knew it was haunted and creepy and weird and not quite right. And then it was books, because frankly, if I could read a book with a unicorn in it, I wanted to find the unicorn in real life. So
That'll do.
yes.
Yeah, I actually thought that would, assuming that we do more than one episode of this, we should spend an entire episode just on your grandmother's house.
Well, I could sit here, I wanted to write like my dissertation on Graham's house. I couldn't quite figure out how to tie it into marketing, but like I was prepared. Like
Yeah, well, I mean, it was a weird place.
it was
Weird. Yeah, I can actually remember in that instance, your mom used to host her, we won't mention it so they don't get embarrassed, CPA firm there, because
terrifying.
it
The
was,
summer thing, right?
yeah, it was always, that's their summer picnic or whatever it was
Yeah.
that they would do. And of course, I mean, it's 2 acres of land on Warwick Neck Avenue. And so you're talking densely populated with two acres. So that's great. And
Probably
every
find it just by
year,
looking at a creepy house, like honestly.
well, every year there was somebody who would come along and be like, "Hey, Beth, I heard your house was haunted when you were growing up," and then she'd have to tell them the stories. And some people would be like, "Oh, that's so funny," ha, ha, ha. And then there'd be some people who are like, "Nope, I'm a leaving."
Bye.
Yeah,
I'll see you later.
keys.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, it definitely that. I mean, I think some of my interest in this subject just comes out of living in New England growing up, because you can't walk 10 steps without running into a legend, a myth, or a monster.
Yes. Well, everything's haunted, and everything is haunted better than the last thing that was haunted. And like like there's literal street posts just everywhere of like, oh, this is the ghost of blah blah
Yeah.
blah.
Yeah. Well, so, in prepping for this, our opening time, I just looked up, just straight up put in, cryptids in Rhode Island. Just cryptids. I didn't go into ghosts or anything else. I was like, let's narrow the search down. And according to Google, just the term Bigfoot in Rhode Island, I'm sorry, in this case, was 2,270,000 results in 0.54 of a second.
Yeah, I mean, sounds
Okay.
right.
Now, of course, it does start off with the fabulous Finding Bigfoot episode that was filmed in Rhode Island. And of course, part of it was filmed in my hometown. But then there's YouTubes of it. There's a book called Legend Meets Truth, the Bigfoot in Rhode Island. I mean, like literally there is, and I'm not even joking, there is the Rhode Island Bigfoot Society and the Squassachusets research team, you know? And again, it's a Squassachusets. And then if you go over to the lovely people of Reddit, which,
Oh yeah.
it's a compendium of the biggest weirdos on the internet. And by the way, I do have to say that it says any Rhode Island cryptids, and the second post says something on the lines of, aren't the people there strange enough?
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, we were just there. I would confirm.
But yeah, there's there's on that point they start getting into the witches and the ghouls and the ghoul of Gloucester and all these other
The
things.
vampires.
The vampires. Why don't you tell me about a vampire in Rhode Island?
Well, there's a lot of them.
Wait, confirm or deny? Are we distantly related to one of them?
We are actually, and not even distantly. It's actually a direct line. I did in fact go and look it up. Grampy would have been so proud of me and my genealogy.
Well, I
I
sometimes wonder
did.
about our genealogy. The Heinz
I did
57 sauce.
almost ask him to break out the picture books just so that I could confirm with the, I wouldn't say first source, but like damn near it. Um, he's only off by like one generation. Because she was 19 or not 19, I'm sorry, 1892. So in the 1890s, Rhode Island was actually the vampire capital of like North America.
I thought that was Santa Clara, California in 1987 with the Lost Boys.
Okay, well, this was in 1890. So,
Oh,
they can migrate. They're like butterflies. Vampires, butterflies.
Mariposas, vampires, all the same.
Same things. Yeah, yeah. So interestingly, Mercy Brown, which is the one we are distantly related to, but not really distant. It's again pretty direct.
Lineage.
Yes. She died in 1892 in January at 19 years old. But she was not the first Rhode Island vampire. The first Rhode Island vampire technically was Sarah Tillinghast. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly.
Tillinghast.
Yeah, her story was more interesting to me than Mercy Brown's, because Mercy Brown's the whole thing was like, oh, her siblings started dying after she died, and they dug her up to check that she was a vampire and saw that she still had blood in her heart and she wasn't decomposed and everything. But she was buried in January and was dug up in March, and it was, Rhode Island in the winter, so it's fairly cold. Sarah Tillinghast, however, she died in, I actually didn't write down what day she died, but I think it was 1985. It was prior to Mercy Brown.
1885.
Yeah. I'm dyslexic and things, and they don't do well. Numbers are hard. And she died in 1885. Her siblings and parents started dying pretty soon after her, and they kept saying that, kept dreaming about her, seeing visions of her. The townsfolk started dying, and they started seeing visions of her before she died. It was like a whole thing, right? So they dug her up after 2.5 years and found that she was not decomposed with blood in her heart and had like scratch marks in her coffin and all this stuff, right? So they burned her heart and crushed it into like the ashes into drinks to give to their sick relatives and people in the town, and then nobody else died. So if anybody was a vampire, I think it was Sarah over here. And then Mercy Brown was, she kind of was like the more well-known one, I would argue, because this poor other girl, this girl named Nellie, she died in 1889. She was the unfortunate victim of a confused identity situation in the 1960s. A bunch of people thought that she was a vampire instead of Mercy Brown. And now apparently she haunts the cemetery because people kept like desecrating her grave and stuff. So she's a vampire turned ghost, but
that
accident
makes no sense, but that's okay.
Oh, hey, I didn't say it made sense. I said, but she did have a weird quote on her tombstone. Her quote on her tombstone said, "I am waiting and watching you," which is weird.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, I guess maybe she meant like, I'm in heaven, and when you die, I'll greet you. Could also
but
be
apparently nothing grew over her grave either.
Or it could mean that she's waiting and watching you,
right?
Like in the physical sense, right
like
now.
In the literal, I am waiting and watching. Which sounds very ominous if you think about it. So the jury's kind of out as to whether or not she was actually a vampire or if she was the mistaken identity of Mercy Brown by school children, and then they thought she was a vampire. I think she was a witch. So,
well, I know a couple of Rhode Island witches.
Well, they can confirm.
Maybe it's one of these, reach out moments, and we could do the, so that people can't identify them. Although actually, one of them, since she just posts on Facebook about how Wiccan she is, I didn't know that you actually, like, I don't sit there and be like, how Baptist am I? But by the way, I do find it interesting that you have two Rhode Islanders talking about cryptozoology and the paranormal in Rhode Island, while one is sitting in Maryland and the other one's sitting in Houston, Texas. But
yes,
hey,
that is both. That is correct. No, we're keeping it safe so we don't summon the ghosts to us.
Oh, yeah. You got it. So the thing about Mercy Brown and what I remember having read about her, even as a kid, was, you know, the idea of her being a vampire was kind of more pushed through because people wanted the folklore more than there was actually evidence of her being
Right.
the
Okay.
Sarah Tillinghast.
That's
That's
weird.
um I do remember vaguely reading about that as I wouldn't say a child, probably as in my teenage years, and talking about the idea of the scratch marks on the inside of her coffin could have been that she was actually catatonic versus actually dead when they buried her, and that's why. But the other thing that I would say is if she were Catholic and she didn't decompose, it would have moved her to sainthood, because that's actually how they look for sainthood in Catholics, in the Catholic religion. 2.5 years is
You
a
know my
pretty
theory on
long
that.
time. Well, I'm just saying it's a long time to go without decomposing.
Well, especially since she died in the winter, and if it was 2.5 years, she would have been in her third summer of being, yeah, underground. Like, and Rhode Island's cold, but it's not that cold. It's not going to keep. And they dug up her siblings who had died in the years since then too, and they had decomposed, and she was the only body that had not. And it was all in the same graveyard. And I mean, New England cemeteries aren't exactly giant. Like, they were
So
practically on top of each other.
here's my question: do you know what cemetery that was?
Um, I can find out. It wasn't Essex, I know that.
No, because that'd be Connecticut.
Exeter.
Exeter. Okay.
Yeah. It is only a 50 square foot cemetery, and it only has 25 burials. She is under an unmarked stone because they kept having ghost issues with it after they, burned her heart and ate it. And I guess the other part of this that was kind of like terrifying, was immediately after she died, the orchard, like her father had an orchard, and half the orchard died, and he kept having visions of her standing out there in the orchard. So they thought that she was sucking the life out of like floral and plants and all this stuff, and then when that wasn't enough, moved on to her siblings and her parents and the town folk, because her dad, and she had 13 siblings, so her dad and 3 of her siblings made it, but 5 of them have died prior to them digging them up. New England had a thing for digging up bodies.
Well, yeah, I mean, if this is the where I think it is too. So I think this. When I was in college, my friend David and I spent a number of nights going to different small cemeteries around Rhode Island. You know that I went to the University of Rhode Island, which is vaguely in North Kingston, Rhode Island. It's actually just called Kingston, but it's really like its own little town. And when David and I, particularly the year that we rented a house in Matunic Beach, we spent an awful lot of nights there, even in that area. So like if you go down to Perryville, Matunic, you're going over towards Kingston, Charlestown, Hope Valley, there's a zillion little tiny cemeteries. I mean, it's kind of like the one that's near your grandfather's farm.
Right. Well, this one is off of Forest Hill Drive. Okay. It's on the right-hand side. Yeah.
I think
walk a bit in.
I think I do know where it is. I don't know that David and I ever particularly explored that one, although I would now. It's interesting. I mean, so the Tillinghast family goes back to the Revolutionary War in Providence. I mean, they're an old family. I was actually thinking, like, I think I went to high school with somebody with that last name. Not sure that it would matter, but
you probably did. But
yeah, well, I mean, West Shirley
had 13 brothers and sisters, and not all of them died.
Right. So that's an interesting one. I like, one of the things that gets laughed at in the paranormal world is when you get into, there's by polling data, a plurality of Americans, and I'm sure this probably pretty true around the world, a plurality believe in ghosts. Almost as many people believe in ghosts as believe in God. Okay.
Well,
In by polling data, the in one of the things that I always say in this sort of realm, when we're talking about the paranormal, you're talking about parapsychology, you're talking about any of this stuff, ESP, I really don't care. um it's kind of like when you're having a debate, facts over feelings. You have to kind of know what you're talking about. So a belief in God is often a feeling. There's a lot of scientific issues around that. But when you talk about something like this, again, you have a plurality of Americans believe in ghosts. If you then change the subject from ghosts to other paranormal things, vampires, all right, a very small number of people believe in the physical existence of things like vampires in America.
as I say, you kind of got to specify that one.
But when you leave America, which by definition is one of the youngest nations, I mean, like
Right.
youngest, quote unquote, six. Wow, that was really blurry. Sorry. One of the quote unquote youngest nations in the world now. And again, I'm not talking about like the fact that half of the nations of Africa now have different names from when I was a kid, um because those are in open rebellion as throughout the time. I'm talking about the European, and it's kind of a little ethnocentric, I guess, but European, Russia, China, these countries that have not substantively changed size and or demographic over the last millennia. All
Right.
right. USA being, in the 250 to 300-year range, we're not an old nation, but we've thrown a lot of the old beliefs like, oh, forget it. It's not real. It's not real. But if you go to Italy, if you go to
Right.
almost any European nation, if you go to the metropolitan centers, you go to Paris and talk about something like vampirism, they're going to laugh you out the door. But there's going to be that one guy from the countryside who's going to be watching you real close.
Okay.
Um, if you go
Yeah.
to other countries, and again, this is just by polling data, you look at a country like India,
Yes.
there's a lot of belief in what we would consider to be supernatural beings.
Well,
Now,
actually, if you Google vampire sightings in India, is actually the first one that pops up, like in the auto fill.
really,
Yep. I thought that was super interesting. Well, because they have it,
oh yeah,
it's all over their mythologies and their folklores. Um, but they have lists and lists and lists of sightings. Like you said for the Bigfoot, there's about it's not quite as much. It's 614,000 results in 0.6 seconds. Um, but again, it is the first pop up.
yeah. Well, the same is true if you do, a simple Google search of vampire sightings, Europe, just Europe, not country. It comes up with 1,450,000 in 0.4 of a second.
Well, there's over 6.7 million if you put it in Asia.
So, I think it's interesting how vastly different the United States is from so many other countries. And I would hazard the guess, and I've never done any research into it, but I would hazard the guess that Canada is kind of similar. Canada is also a fairly young nation. I mean, up until I forget when they got their independence from Europe or from England, but as far as I know, they still actually have some sort of royal connection. So as a country, it's a more younger nation. But if you go and you look at their First Nations
Right.
folklore, then you're going to get into, like, I mean, that's where you get the skinwalker kind of concepts, and the
Elephant skin.
Wendigo,
I don't
that
like
kind
it.
of and I do think I think it's interesting that Americans throw it all out until you start talking about like New Orleans, you know,
Yes. Well, yeah.
and I, wow, I stutter. Um, I wonder how much of that is done from Anne Rice. Like Anne Rice wrote the Vampire Lestat, right? And so in the 1970s, I think is when she first wrote the first one, which I think is called Interview with a Vampire. And all of a sudden,
Okay.
everybody could see vampires in New Orleans. But I have a relative who will remain nameless, or we'd have to change the name so that they don't find this on YouTube someday and beat us up, who could swear that they saw a vampire under a a telephone pole light.
I thought that
Thank you. What part of "who will remain nameless" did you miss? And I'm gonna have to go back and edit that out.
well
And in fact, I think what I'll do is I'll bring it right up to that point where you say, "I thought it was," and we're gonna get the thank you on the next end of it.
well
But yes,
she's not gonna be that's up for it, frankly.
yeah, be careful.
Mm.
But that is true. I mean, she in fact had asked me one day. I mean, and to be fair, I mean, in
Say
today's
her name.
in my defense, or in my parlance, however you want to look at it, I would have been a goth in high school, except that I don't think the term existed then. But long dark duster coats.
Like
Yes,
dye
I
your
did.
hair and it came out green.
I did, because I wanted to look like David from the Lost Boys, Kiefer
You were trying to look
Sutherland's
like a
character.
vampire. Excellent work.
Well, it was for Halloween. That's what you do. For about 7 years, I didn't know there was another costume I could choose other than vampire. But anyway, I mean, I was fascinated with vampire movies and lore at that time, and she just asked me one day, like, do you believe? And I said, I don't know. I mean, I don't, and I do. Like, there's some solid evidence that something's going on. I mean, you don't have a legend that sits around for millennia without some kernel of truth in the background. But I don't know that, I don't do suck your blood is coming along behind you. And I definitely was more of the idea that if there were vampires, they should look like the people from the Lost Boys more than Nosferatu,
Oh.
Yeah, that's not what I wanted to be.
But you would be down to look like a Lost Boy. Got it.
Oh no, we're going to run out of time. Can
you only do 30 minutes on personal?
Yeah, it's got a countdown right now of 9 minutes and 44 seconds. I wonder if the audience will see that too. Yeah, we're so cheap that we are only using free. We were going to have to upgrade if people actually enjoy this. But I think we do a disservice. I mean, the problem is in you're what?
We weren't naming people.
Well, because I'm just going to say a truth, which is, all right, fine. Your uncle would say, well, you have several of those. I would say, fine, we have a relative who says that I'm more likely to believe in something the more outlandish it is. And they're not wrong.
Yeah, fair.
But I also think that in a world where we think that everything that is important in the world is what's physically here, whether it's the microphone I'm talking into or the cell phone that's sitting here with a countdown in front of me. And I'm wondering if Tom Cruise is going to come busting in and be like, you
never finished your other story though, from the vampire under the streetlight. I mean, that's the whole story, but
well, yeah. Well, anyways, good God, this be jump cuts. She definitely, asked me, if I believed. And then when I said, well, I really don't know. I mean, I think that there's a lot out there that we don't really know about yet. And she said, because when I was younger, I thought I saw this guy underneath a street lamp. And, 1 second he's there, 1 second he's gone. And she said, I remember thinking back in that time, I wonder if it could have been, like a vampire or a ghost or something like that. Now, considering that she grew up in Pawcatuck, Connecticut, which is attached to Westerly, Rhode Island. I mean, there's just a little bridge over the Pawcatuck River. There's the difference. And it's just as old. I mean, reality is you've been in those neighborhoods. Some of those houses themselves date back to the 1800s,
right. I mean, those houses there are freaky.
Maybe even the 1700s. I mean, again, I'm watching this counter close. But if you look at your grandmother's house, like we said, we're going to use that as an episode at some point. That house, I think, was started in 1852 and completed in the 1860s. And a lot of the, that was a huge, it would probably would have been considered a manor house back then, and or the main farmer's house. But those row houses in Pawcatuck and Stonington, Connecticut, and those towns have been around since the very foundation of the colonial America, not
Right.
America meaning after 1776. And I would have hazarded that even if the house wasn't around in
There was
the
some structure.
1600s, some of that structure came from that time period. The
Right.
stones. I mean, your great grandmother's house, where this would have happened with my mom, I mean, they didn't use brick in the foundation. It was rock. It was
Yeah.
rounded, and it was like river rock, you know.
Well, I mean, even the stone walls in New England that like notate property lines and stuff, some of those have been there for literal centuries. Like you can use them pretty directly to track old houses and foundations and stuff.
Well, look at what they're doing with the Wheeler Farm up near
Yeah.
your grandfather. I mean, in that, I forget what the farthest back, when was it, 1620, 1627, something like that?
No, it was 1609, I thought.
I
Oh,
mean,
the cemetery?
yeah, you're
Yeah.
talking about a person who was likely born in the 1500s.
Right.
One of the very first settlers of the area that became known as Stonington, Connecticut.
Right.
Um, all this to say, as we spend some time in New England and get back on track. By the
Been
way,
there.
your brother 100% predicted that we would start on, A. We're trying to get to B, but we were gonna
That's what
that.
makes us funny,
But
obviously.
we're gonna spend some time in Rhode Island first. My next thing that I'm going to bring is actually evidence of cryptozoology, and of course, because he's my favorite big hairy guy to talk about, the Bigfoot sightings, and where my absolute conviction in Bigfoot began as a child at 13 years old, running through the Potter Hill area of Westerly. What are you going to bring to the table next? You did the vampires,
Which is
witches. Would you like me to put you in touch with a Rhode Island witch to talk to?
no, I'm sure I have a couple on my Facebook. It's fine. Um, or Instagram will find some because it heard me talking about it. No, I
Are
was
you
gonna go
looking
for
for
witches.
tarot cards?
Yeah, that's exactly what it's gonna be. Yeah, because I have my books, and for some reason, if you have a book account on Instagram, it automatically assumes that you must be into witches. So they're all just kind of there. So I was gonna do witches, and then I was gonna do ghosties.
All right. Well, I'm gonna do Big Hairy Man for our next episode. You prep the witches, and then I think we'll handle ghosties together because we got some stories that we can tell.
We might need the pro version just for the ghost. It's gonna be like a 3-point saga of like.
Oh, I just want to point out that your current T-shirt, and here's a teaser, the current T-shirt you're wearing actually ties into a ghost story. Mickey Mouse and
Does
your
that mean I
grand.
can talk about St. Augustine? Because that one's freaky.
Well, I mean, we're we're going to get there eventually. But I was thinking your brother, a Mickey Mouse
Oh,
alarm
a clock.
clock,
Yeah.
and
Gotcha.
keys that don't like to stay still in the night.
No, yeah, that's a good one. That is. And the
Um,
closet. You can't forget the closet in there.
I definitely, I think for the ghosty one, I'm definitely for Rhode Island ghosties. There's a couple of episodes from Ghost Hunters, which was largely filmed in Rhode Island in the beginning, that I'd love to pull a couple of things and be like, yes, yes, but wow. And I don't know if Jason Hawes would be up to talking to us at some point in the future, but that'd be a lot of fun, I think, to
Don't you have
pull
him on
him in.
Facebook?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there you go.
I mean, we used to live up the road from his office, like the pink office that was the TAPS office at that time.
No, I know.
So, well, yeah,
That's
I mean, you were what, maybe 6 or 7 when we moved out that house, is that right?
I remember that house.
No,
I remember
you had been, yeah, I guess you were about 6 when we
Mhm.
moved out.
I remember it vividly.
The big greenhouse that
I like
flooded
the big house that
a
flooded.
lot.
Yes, I remember painting the basement with like ceiling paint, but it was on like that stone
Hmm. Yeah, it was
walls.
sealant, not
Yeah,
ceiling. I did not have my 6-year-old up on the ceiling painting.
I
We
meant
did have
ceiling
her
as
in the
in,
back.
not as in C, but as in like S.
All right, we're gonna sign off.